They told you Western civilization was the pinnacle of human achievement. They told you it represented reason, progress, and moral superiority. They told you that everything good in this world came from Europe and its descendants. But what if I told you that this entire narrative is one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in human history? Let's start with the basics. What exactly is Western civilization? According to the people who created this concept, it's the idea that human progress, reason, democracy, science, and moral development all originated in ancient Greece and Rome, then spread through Europe, and eventually to the Americas. But here's the first problem with this story. The people we call ancient Greeks didn't call themselves that. They were Mediterranean peoples who learned from Egyptians, traded with Africans, and built their knowledge on foundations that came from the very continent they now pretend was uncivilized. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, wrote that the Egyptians were black, and that the Greeks learned their religion, mathematics, and philosophy from them. Aristotle studied in Egypt for 13 years, at the Library of Alexandria, which was built by Africans, and contained the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. But somehow, in the retelling of history, these facts disappeared. The Egyptians became Middle Eastern. The Library of Alexandria became a Greek achievement, and the entire foundation of what they call Western knowledge was whitewashed and repackaged as European innovation. Let's talk about timelines, because this is where their story completely falls apart. While Europeans were still living in caves and struggling with basic agriculture, Africans were building some of the most sophisticated civilizations the world had ever seen. The Kingdom of Kush was ruling Egypt and building pyramids when Rome was just a collection of mud huts. Great Zimbabwe was a thriving metropolis with advanced urban planning, when London had maybe 20,000 people living in squalor. The University of Timbuktu was producing scholars and preserving knowledge when most Europeans couldn't read or write. Geno in Mali, founded around 250 BCE, was one of the world's first true cities, with sophisticated urban planning, specialized crafts, and international trade networks. This was happening while the people who would later call themselves the foundation of Western civilization were still figuring out basic metallurgy. The Nok culture in Nigeria was smelting iron and creating sophisticated art, 1,000 years before the Common Era. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing high-grade steel using furnaces that reached 1,800 degrees Celsius, temperatures that Europeans wouldn't achieve until the Industrial Revolution. But none of this appears in their Western civilization narrative. Why? Because acknowledging African achievement would destroy the entire foundation of their superiority myth. Here's what they don't teach you about Western civilization. It wasn't built on reason, progress, or moral superiority. It was built on the most systematic campaign of violence, theft, and genocide in human history. Samuel Huntington, a Harvard professor and one of their own scholars, admitted this truth. The West won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but rather by its superiority in applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do. Let that sink in. Their own scholar, from their most prestigious university, admitted that Western dominance came from violence, not from any inherent superiority of their civilization. The wealth that built European cities came from the systematic looting of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The gold that filled European treasuries was stolen from African kingdoms. The labor that built their plantations was stolen from African people. The knowledge that filled their universities was stolen from African libraries and scholars. But they rewrote this history. They turned theft into trade, slavery into labor systems, genocide into colonization, and cultural destruction into civilization. Let's destroy one of their most cherished myths, the idea that philosophy, mathematics, and science originated in ancient Greece. This is perhaps the most audacious lie in their entire narrative. Thales, who they call the first philosopher, studied in Egypt and learned from African priests. Pythagoras, famous for his theorem, spent over 20 years studying in Egypt and was initiated into African mystery schools. Plato wrote that the Egyptians had been studying mathematics and astronomy for thousands of years before the Greeks even existed. The mathematical concepts they attribute to the Greeks were already ancient in Africa. The Lubombo bone, found in Swaziland and dating back 35,000 years, is the world's oldest mathematical artifact. African astronomers were mapping the stars and calculating celestial movements, while Europeans were still trying to figure out agriculture. The Dogon people of Mali had detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system, including information about Sirius B, a star that Europeans couldn't even see until they invented telescopes. How did they know this? Because African astronomical knowledge was far more advanced than anything Europeans possessed. But in their retelling, all of this becomes Greek innovation. They erased the African teachers, ignored the Egyptian schools, and created a fantasy where knowledge spontaneously appeared in Europe. Christianity wasn't just a religion in the hands of European colonizers, it was a weapon, a tool specifically designed to destroy African consciousness and replace it with European control. Before Christianity arrived, Africans had sophisticated spiritual systems that connected them to their ancestors, their land, and their cosmic understanding. They had social structures that emphasized community, reciprocity, and collective responsibility. Christianity came with a different message. Submit to authority. Accept suffering in this life for rewards in the next. Your ancestors were pagans. Your traditions were evil. Your knowledge was worthless. Only through European interpretation of a Middle Eastern religion could you find salvation. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, himself a Christian, understood this perfectly. When the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, "Let us pray." We closed our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. But Christianity wasn't just about taking land. It was about taking minds. It was about convincing Africans that everything about their heritage was inferior, and that salvation could only come through adopting European ways of thinking and being. This psychological colonization was more devastating than physical conquest. Because once you convince people that their own culture is worthless, they'll help you destroy it themselves. They love to talk about the scientific revolution as a European achievement. But what they don't tell you is that this revolution was built on knowledge stolen from Africa and other non-European civilizations. The medical knowledge that Europeans discovered had been practiced in Africa for centuries. Surgical procedures, including cataract surgery and cesarean sections, were routine in African societies when Europeans were still using leeches and bloodletting. The astronomical observations that led to European discoveries were based on calculations and star charts that had been developed in African centers of learning. The mathematical principles that enabled European advances were concepts that had been taught in African universities for generations. Even the compass, which they credit for enabling European exploration, was invented in China and perfected by African navigators who had been crossing oceans for centuries before Europeans left the Mediterranean. But in their narrative, all of this becomes European innovation. They took the knowledge, destroyed the sources, and then claimed credit for the discoveries. Western civilization wasn't built in Europe. It was built on the systematic extraction of wealth from the rest of the world, particularly Africa. The Industrial Revolution, which they present as the pinnacle of Western achievement, was funded by profits from the slave trade and colonial exploitation. The factories of Manchester were built with cotton picked by enslaved Africans. The banks of London were capitalized with gold, stolen from African kingdoms. But it wasn't just raw materials. They also extracted human capital. The millions of Africans who were enslaved and transported to the Americas represented the largest forced transfer of knowledge, skills, and labor in human history. These weren't primitive people being civilized. These were skilled craftspeople, farmers, engineers, artists, and scholars, whose knowledge and abilities built the economic foundation of what they now call Western civilization. The rice cultivation that made South Carolina wealthy was African knowledge. The iron-working techniques that built American industry were African innovations. The architectural styles that defined colonial cities were African designs. But they erased this history. They turned skilled Africans into property and African innovations into American ingenuity. The myth of Western civilization isn't just historical propaganda. It's an active educational program designed to maintain psychological dominance over the rest of the world. In schools across the globe, children are taught that civilization began in Greece and Rome, that the Renaissance was a European awakening, that the Enlightenment was a European intellectual achievement, and that democracy was a European invention. But none of this is true. Civilization began in Africa. The so-called Renaissance was Europeans finally gaining access to African and Islamic knowledge they had lost during their Dark Ages. The Enlightenment was built on philosophical concepts that had existed in African societies for centuries. And democracy was practiced in African communities long before Europeans created their limited versions. This educational indoctrination serves a specific purpose. It convinces people around the world that European ways of thinking and organizing society are not just different, but superior. It creates a psychological dependency where people believe they need European validation to be legitimate. Even the language they use reveals the supremacist foundation of their narrative. They call their period of ignorance the Dark Ages, but describe their recovery as the Enlightenment. They call their expansion exploration, but their victims' resistance savagery. They describe African societies as tribes, but European groups as nations. They call African leaders chiefs, but European leaders kings. They describe African knowledge as folklore, but European knowledge as science. This isn't accidental. It's a carefully constructed linguistic system designed to make European experiences seem normal and universal, while making everyone else's experiences seem primitive and particular. When Africans built massive stone cities, they call them mysterious and wonder who really built them. When Europeans built castles, they're celebrated as architectural achievements. When Africans developed sophisticated political systems, they're ignored or dismissed. When Europeans created monarchies, they're studied as political innovations. The myth of Western civilization didn't end with colonialism. It continues today in new forms, designed to maintain the same psychological and economic dominance. They call it development, but it's the same old extraction. African countries are told they need to adopt Western economic models, Western political systems, Western educational approaches to become developed. But what does this development actually look like? It looks like African countries exporting raw materials to Western factories, then buying back finished products at inflated prices. It looks like African students learning European history and literature, while their own heritage is ignored or marginalized. It looks like African cities being rebuilt according to Western urban planning models, destroying traditional community structures that had worked for centuries. It looks like African farmers being forced to grow cash crops for export, instead of food crops for their own communities. This is neocolonialism, the same extraction and domination, just with different language and methods. The most devastating aspect of the Western civilization myth isn't the historical lies. It's the psychological damage it continues to inflict on people around the world. when you convince people that their ancestors were primitive, that their traditions are backward, that their ways of thinking are inferior. You create a deep psychological wound that can last for generations. This is why you see people of African descent straightening their hair to look more European, bleaching their skin to appear lighter, rejecting their own cultural practices in favor of Western alternatives. This is why you see African countries abandoning traditional governance systems that emphasized consensus and community in favor of Western democratic models that often don't work in their cultural contexts. This is why you see African scholars studying European philosophers and theorists, while ignoring the rich intellectual traditions of their own continent. The myth of Western civilization creates what Frantz Fanon called internalized oppression, where the oppressed begin to believe in their own inferiority and actively participate in their own domination. Modern archaeology is systematically destroying the Western civilization myth by uncovering evidence of African achievement that can no longer be ignored or dismissed. The discovery of Geno proved that Africans were building sophisticated cities centuries before similar developments in Europe. The excavation of Great Zimbabwe revealed architectural techniques that surpassed anything Europeans were doing at the time. The analysis of ancient African metallurgy has shown that African iron and steel production was more advanced than European techniques for over 1,000 years. The study of African astronomical sites has revealed mathematical and scientific knowledge that predates European discoveries by centuries. But even when faced with overwhelming archaeological evidence, the Western academic establishment finds ways to minimize or explain away African achievements. They claim that African cities must have been built by non-Africans. They argue that African technologies must have been learned from outsiders. They suggest that African knowledge must have been acquired through contact with more advanced civilizations. This isn't scholarship. It's propaganda disguised as academic research. The current global economic system is designed to perpetuate the same extraction that built Western civilization in the first place. African countries, despite being rich in natural resources, remain poor because they're locked into a system that forces them to export raw materials at low prices and import finished goods at high prices. The same gold that built European treasuries is still being extracted from African mines. But now, the profits go to multinational corporations instead of colonial governments. The same agricultural products that funded European development are still being grown on African land. But now they're controlled by international agribusiness instead of colonial plantations. The same intellectual property that Europeans stole from African societies is now protected by international copyright and patent laws that prevent Africans from benefiting from their own traditional knowledge. This isn't free trade. It's organized theft with legal protection. While they were destroying African cultures through colonialism and Christianity, Europeans were simultaneously stealing African cultural innovations and claiming them as their own. Jazz, blues, rock and roll, hip-hop, all of these musical forms were created by people of African descent, but were commercialized and profited from by European-descended entrepreneurs. The artistic techniques, architectural styles, and design principles that they now call modern or contemporary were often borrowed from African traditions without acknowledgement or compensation. Even the democratic ideals that they claim as uniquely Western were influenced by African political systems that European colonizers encountered and adapted. But in their narrative, all of this becomes Western innovation. They take the culture, erase the source, and claim the credit. Despite centuries of systematic suppression, African knowledge, culture, and consciousness are experiencing a powerful revival. African scholars are reclaiming their history and challenging Western academic narratives. African artists are celebrating their heritage and rejecting European aesthetic standards. African leaders are developing economic and political models based on traditional African values. The internet and global communication have made it impossible to completely suppress African voices and perspectives. Young people around the world are discovering the truth about African history and achievement, despite the continued propaganda in their schools. This revival represents an existential threat to the Western civilization myth. Because once people understand the truth about African achievement, the entire foundation of Western supremacy collapses. The myth of Western civilization has served its purpose. It justified colonialism, enabled exploitation, and maintained psychological dominance for over 500 years. But myths, no matter how powerful, eventually crumble when confronted with truth. The truth is that human civilization is a global achievement, with contributions from every continent and every people. The truth is that Africa was not only a participant in this development, but often led it. The truth is that Western civilization, as it's commonly understood, is a propaganda construct designed to justify domination and extraction. Recognizing this truth doesn't diminish the genuine achievements of European peoples, but it does put them in proper perspective as part of a larger human story rather than the center of it. For too long, we've allowed others to tell our story. We've accepted their version of history, their definition of civilization, their standards of achievement. But the evidence is overwhelming. The archaeological record is clear. The historical documents exist. Africa was not the dark continent they claimed it was. Africa was the birthplace of human civilization, the source of knowledge and innovation, the foundation upon which the world was built. It's time to reclaim our story. It's time to reject their myths. It's time to celebrate our achievements, not as footnotes to European history, but as the central narrative of human development. The myth of Western civilization has had its day. The truth of African achievement is rising. And no amount of propaganda, no matter how sophisticated, can suppress it forever. The question isn't whether this truth will emerge. The question is whether we'll be part of telling it, or whether we'll continue to accept their lies about who we are and what we've accomplished. The choice is ours. If this resonates with you, if you're tired of the lies and ready for the truth, then it's time to do your own research. Read African historians, study archaeological evidence, question everything you were taught about Western civilization. Because the truth has been there all along, waiting for us to reclaim it. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. The myth of Western civilization ends with us. The truth of African achievement begins with us. Let's make sure the world knows the real story.